They didn't even help her off the wagon. Lorene gripped the side rail, her cane slipping in the mud as she struggled to lower herself down. The townsfolk watched from their porches, whispering. Some laughed. "That's the new wife? She can't even walk straight." She heard it. They wanted her to. Her dress was simple, too tight across the hips from the swelling in her joints, and one shoe was worn nearly through from dragging her weaker leg. But she'd come this far, all the way from Missouri, all for a man she'd only seen once, a rancher who'd lost his first wife and was left with 2 sons. She didn't expect love, just a home, a place where her body wouldn't make her a burden. But when she finally stood at the gate, her husband didn't come out. It was the older son who opened the door, barely 10 years old, with tired eyes and a jaw too stiff for his age. He looked her up and down, then turned and walked away without a word. She limped after him, her suitcase thumping against the wooden floor. Inside, the house was cold and half dark. No fire, no welcome, just silence and dust. The younger boy peeked around the corner, maybe 5, maybe 6, and ducked away as soon as she saw him. "Where's your father?" she asked, her voice trembling more than she wanted. The older boy shrugged. "Gone out. He don't like cripples." The words hit her like a slap. But she didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. Instead, she set her bag by the fireplace, sank into a crooked chair, and stared at the cold ashes. She wasn't wanted, not by the town, not by the man, not even by the boys. But she was here. And that meant something. She took out the folded letter he'd written months ago. The one that said, "My sons need a mother more than I need a wife. If you've got kindness in you, that'll be enough." She read it twice. Then, slowly, she pushed herself up from the chair, grabbed the broom by the door, and began to sweep. She didn't know if they'd ever call her Mama. But by God, she would act like one until they did. By morning, the kitchen smelled like something the boys hadn't known in months. Bread. Real bread. Not burnt crusts or hard biscuits their father traded for. Lorene had risen before dawn, hands aching, knees stiff, but she'd ground flour with her arms trembling and shaped loaves with fingers that curled at the joints. She'd found a sack of flour in the cellar and an old cast-iron pan covered in cobwebs. She didn't ask permission. She just made breakfast. The younger boy, Micah, hovered in the doorway, as if unsure whether he'd get swatted for coming too close. Lorene turned and smiled. Not the bright kind, just enough to let him know he was safe. "There's honey on the shelf," she said. "Want to help me find it?" He edged forward, barefoot on the cold boards. "Mama used to put it in tea," he said softly, not looking at her. Lorene nodded, fighting the swell in her throat. "Well, maybe we'll try that again." The older boy, Eli, stomped in moments later, scowling at the sound of her humming. "You don't belong here," he said. "Pa only wrote that letter 'cause he was drunk." She didn't answer right away, just poured him a cup of hot milk and placed it on the table beside the bread. "You don't have to like me," she said, her voice calm, "but your brother needs breakfast, and so do you." Eli didn't sit, but he didn't leave either. He just stared at the cup like it was something dangerous. When the door opened, Lorene turned, thinking it was the father returned. But it wasn't. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Haverly, face pinched with curiosity. "I heard there was a new bride," she said, stepping in without invitation. Her eyes swept over Lorene's limp, her hands dusted in flour. "Well, seems he got himself a helper after all." She meant it as insult. Lorene heard it clear, but she smiled anyway. "I'm baking extra," she said. "Would you like to take a loaf home?" The woman hesitated, then took it, and left without another word. When the door closed, Lorene noticed Eli had sat down. He hadn't touched the milk yet, but he was tearing off a piece of bread with both hands, slow, like he didn't want her to see. That night, no one said thank you. But the pan was empty. And Lorene sat alone on the porch with her aching knees, holding the quiet like it was something sacred. Lorene found the letter folded behind the salt tin, where the boys had likely stashed it after their father fell ill. It was stained at the edges, the paper thin from being handled too often, like something read in secret. She hadn't meant to pry. She was just cleaning the shelves, moving jars, wiping dust, feeling useful again. But the name on the envelope stopped her cold. To whoever comes after me. Her breath caught. It wasn't addressed to anyone specific, not even to his sons, just after. She turned it over once, twice, then opened it slowly, the crinkle of the paper loud in the silence of the kitchen. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, but unmistakably male. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. Lorene pressed a hand to her chest. I never thought I'd ask a stranger to care for my boys, but I ain't got no choice. They're good boys, stubborn, like their mother. But they've been through hell since she passed. Lorene blinked fast. The words blurred. I didn't marry again for love. I married again for them. That line broke something in her, because he hadn't lied to her. He hadn't promised romance or warmth or even kindness. Just a name, a roof, a place. And she had accepted it, not for lack of options, but for one small chance at usefulness. The letter went on. If she's still here, it means she stayed. That alone's enough for me. Let her stay. Lorene folded the paper with shaking hands and placed it back behind the salt. She didn't tell the boys. Not then. Not yet. Instead, she wiped her eyes and went outside to where Micah was trying to tie a rope swing from the low branch of the elm. His fingers were too small, the knot messy. May I? She asked, kneeling beside him. He hesitated, then nodded. She tied it slow, showing him as she went. Eli watched from the porch, arms folded, eyes wary. When she stood, her knee gave out slightly. Micah reached to steady her, his hand slipping into hers without thought. That night, the wind blew hard against the house, but inside was warm. Lorene didn't sleep much. She sat at the table, tracing that line in her mind over and over. Let her stay. She had come here with nothing. But somehow, in the quiet space between grief and duty, she was becoming something these boys hadn't known they still needed. It started with a sharp pain behind her hip. Not unusual. She'd been pushing herself, carrying firewood, lifting pots, kneeling too long to clean the boys' muddy boots. But this pain didn't fade. It spread. By morning, Lorene couldn't stand without clutching the edge of the table. She tried to hide it, told Eli to take his brother down to the creek for water, said she needed to scrub the floor in peace. When they left, she tried to make it to the stove to boil oats, but halfway there, her legs gave out. She caught herself against the chair, heart pounding. The room tilted. Her breath came short and fast. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't rested. She had wanted so badly to prove she belonged here. She had ignored every warning sign. Her hands shook as she reached for the ladle on the counter, not to cook, but to knock against the wall. Just once. Then again. She wasn't sure if anyone would hear. But the sound of boots pounding on the porch came minutes later. Eli. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, eyes wide. She tried to smile. Guess I overdid it. He didn't smile back. You can't keep trying to do everything. Then softer. You're not her. Lorene froze. The silence that followed felt louder than any shout. I know. she said finally, her voice small. "But I'm trying to be something for you." He looked down at her for a long time. Then he knelt, awkward, boyish, unsure, and helped her sit properly. "You don't have to be her," he muttered. "You just have to not leave." That night they all ate together on the porch, Micah curled up with his head on her good knee. Eli sat on the step below her, watching the stars but every now and then glancing back, checking if she was still there. The boys didn't talk much. They didn't hug her. But they didn't run either. Lorene knew something had shifted. Not in the way they saw her, maybe, but in what they expected from her. She was no longer the crippled bride who cooked and cleaned. She was someone who had fallen and hadn't left. That was the beginning of trust. Not loud, not fast, just there. And it was more than she'd ever had before. And the next week, word spread through town like spilled grain. Half true, half imagined. Some said the crippled bride had collapsed alone and made the boy feed her. Others whispered that the rancher's sons had taken pity and let her stay out of guilt. Lorene heard it all at the feed store, in line behind Mrs. Abley, who didn't bother lowering her voice. Sad thing, really. Boys need a real mother, not a charity case with a limp. Lorene kept her chin high, but her grip tightened around the sack of flour. She walked home slower that day, not from pain, but from the weight of those words. Still, the boys met her at the fence. Micah ran to grab the sack, even though it was heavier than him. Eli offered her his hand, not out of pity, but because he'd seen the way she winced on gravel. Inside the house, she found a surprise waiting. The table was set. Sloppily, yes. Forks upside down, napkins wrinkled. But it was their doing. Eli had made potatoes. Micah had drawn her a picture with crooked letters that read, "To Miss Lorene. Thank you for staying." Her throat tightened. These boys didn't care about town whispers. They cared about presence, about warmth, about someone who didn't vanish in the night. That evening, she heard horses outside, Sheriff Riggins. And beside him, Ruth Harland, the rancher's cousin. Lorene stepped onto the porch with her cane, feeling suddenly like a trespasser in her own home. Ruth wasted no time. "They're not yours, and they shouldn't be your burden. My brother-in-law's family is willing to take the boys in. They'd have cousins. Real school." Lorene said nothing. Not because she was afraid, but because Micah had come out behind her and taken her hand. "We already have someone." Ruth's face reddened, but Riggins just tipped his hat. "Boys seem content. I've seen worse arrangements." Lorene didn't flinch when Ruth turned away with a final glare, because inside her chest, something was rising. Not arrogance, not defiance, but something stronger. Belonging. Not because the town approved, but because two boys did. That night, Lorene stayed up late mending Eli's torn shirt. Every stitch was a promise. She didn't have their blood, but she had their trust. And that, she decided, would be enough. They called it a hearing, but everyone in town treated it like a trial. The old judge came down from Dry Creek, sat behind a desk in the church hall, and looked over his glasses like he already knew the answer. Ruth Harland filed the petition herself, to remove the crippled girl from a guardianship she was never given. No one asked Lorene how many socks she'd mended, how many meals she'd made with half a pantry and no help. They just stared at her leg, at her limp, at the way she stood beside Micah and Eli like she was trying to pass herself off as something she wasn't. "She's not blood," Ruth kept repeating. "The father's will was never found. We can't assume she was meant to stay." Lorene said little. She only looked to the boys. Eli's hand squeezed hers once. That was enough. When they asked if she had anything to say, Lorene nodded. Slowly stepped forward. Her voice was steady. "I don't have land, or money, or a famous name. But I've had Eli's fevered head in my lap when no one else came. I've taught Micah to spell his brother's name. They don't eat from obligation. They eat because I cook. They sleep because I lock the doors. If that's not being a mother, then I don't know what is." The room was dead quiet. For once, even Ruth had no reply, but the judge cleared his throat. "It isn't a matter of love. It's a matter of law." And just like that, it seemed done. The town already shifting in its seats, whispering again. But then Eli stood, small, thin, voice cracking. "Sir, can I say something?" The judge paused, nodded, and Eli walked over to Lorene, took her hand, looked the judge dead in the eye. "She's our mama. She's the only one that stayed, and she limps 'cause of what happened to her, not what she is. You can send her away. But then you're sending us away too." That silence was heavier than the first. The judge looked down, then away, then finally back at Ruth. "No formal will, but I see no harm being done. Petition denied." Lorene didn't cry, not then. But when Micah whispered, "Does this mean you're really ours?" she finally let her knees buckle, and the boys caught her. They thought it would end after the hearing, that the town would go back to normal, that Ruth Harland would retreat in quiet shame. But shame doesn't come easy to folks who've spent years nursing their own pride. She showed up at the general store the next morning, loudly demanding her late brother's belongings, including the boys' only coats. She pointed at Lorene in the aisle, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still pretending? What else you gonna steal in God's name?" Lorene didn't answer, but Eli did. That small boy stepped between them, face tight, shoulders squared, voice loud. "She didn't steal nothin'. You gave us up the minute Pa died. You left a pie on the porch and said it was too much for a woman to handle. Lorene's the only one who thought we were worth anything." People stopped stocking shelves. The storekeeper froze with a scoop of flour mid-air. Micah stepped beside his brother, holding up his tattered spelling book. "She taught me every letter in here. You didn't even remember which of us was older." Ruth's face twisted. Children don't decide their guardians. But the town had seen too much. And this time, it wasn't just the boys who stood up. Mrs. Hemsworth from the bakery folded her arms. "I've seen that girl walk those boys to school every morning, rain or shine." Old Bert behind the counter added, "Watched her fix that leaky roof alone last spring. Ruth, did you even bring a bucket when the storm hit?" One by one, voices rose. Not loud, not angry, just truthful. Lorene stood in the middle of it, stunned. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't tried to make a scene. But something had shifted, something the town couldn't pretend not to feel anymore. Ruth turned on her heel and marched out, face flushed, muttering about how the West had lost its standards. But no one followed. Micah turned to Lorene, eyes wide. "Did we just win again?" Lorene laughed, a real full laugh that echoed off the wooden beams. "I think we just lived loud enough they couldn't ignore us." Eli tugged her hand. "Can we get apples now?" The clerk handed her two without charging a cent. She took them with shaking fingers. Maybe it wasn't about courts or names or blood. Maybe it was just about being seen. And finally, she was. That night, Lorene didn't sleep on the cot anymore. The boys insisted she take the bed, the one their father used to sleep in, while they pulled their quilts onto the floor beside her. She tried to argue, but Micah looked her straight in the eyes and said, "We ain't been afraid since you came." That's gotta mean something. And so, 3 breathing bodies shared one small room, no longer unsure where they belonged. Lorene stared at the ceiling as moonlight sliced through the curtain. The old ache in her leg throbbed from walking too far, too long, but it didn't matter now. What mattered was the way Eli had tucked a crumpled drawing of her into his pillow. What mattered was that Micah had whispered, half asleep, "You make this house not feel haunted anymore." Morning brought chores, and Lorene moved slowly, her hip stiff, but her heart strangely light. She didn't notice the silence at first. It wasn't until she stepped onto the porch that she realized the usual judgmental hush from passing townsfolk was gone. Instead, she caught a nod from Mr. Pritchard as he loaded his wagon. A tip of the hat from the banker's wife. They weren't cheering, but they weren't pretending she didn't exist either, and that was more than she'd dared hope. Inside, the boys were making something out of scraps. A gift, they said. Lorene tried not to look, but they were terrible at keeping secrets. By afternoon, she saw what it was. A carved sign, crooked but bold. "Our mama lives here." Micah grinned, cheeks smudged with paint. "We thought it should be official." Lorene touched the letters, rough under her fingers. "You sure?" Eli nodded fiercely. "You came, you stayed. That's all it took." Later, as the sun dipped low, she nailed it above the door. A woman with a limp, 2 boys with too much loss behind their eyes, and a new name for something they'd all thought was gone. Family. A neighbor brought over leftover stew that evening. The boys invited her in, proud to show off the painted sign. She blinked fast and said, "He would have been proud." They all knew who he was. Lorene didn't speak. She just ladled out stew and set 3 places at the table. It still creaked. The oil lamp still flickered. But for the first time since the train ride west, Lorene felt like she had arrived somewhere worth staying. The boys had mentioned their father once wrote everything down in a box, but no one had dared touch it. That morning, while cleaning the pantry, Lorene found it wedged between old jars and a cracked lantern. A wooden chest, dusty but intact. The latch creaked like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside were receipts, a coin pouch, and folded letters, most addressed to the boys, never mailed. She hesitated. Then she read. Each page was like a map into the mind of the man they'd both lost and never truly known. One note to Eli read, "You were born crying, but calmed the second I touched you. You'll calm storms, boy, I know it." Another to Micah. "You fight everything now, but you'll fight for others one day. That's what makes a man." Then, near the bottom, one letter with no name. It was addressed simply, "To the woman who will raise my sons if I can't." Lorene's breath caught. She sat on the porch, fingers trembling. "If you're reading this, I must be gone. I pray someone good finds my boys. Not someone perfect, just someone who stays. Someone who loves them enough to fight for them. If she needs to know, yes, I picked this land for them. Yes, I hoped to raise them here. But more than that, I hoped they'd one day find a mother who chose them." Lorene folded it slowly, carefully, pressing it to her chest like a sacred thing. She didn't tell the boys. Not yet. It wasn't the kind of thing they needed to hear aloud. It was the kind of truth that worked its way quietly into how you made dinner, how you kissed a forehead goodnight, how you stood between them and the world. That night, she read the letter one more time before locking it away. She added her own. "To the boys, if I'm ever not here, I want you to know, you were the reason I stopped running. You were the ones who called me Mama before I believed I was worthy of it, and that made all the difference." She tucked it beside his. 2 letters, side by side. A father's hope and a mother's choice. And in the quiet of the cabin, as wind rustled through the shutters and the fire cracked gently in the hearth, Lorene realized no judge or town could name her role here. She had earned it. Every day, every step, every whispered mama when the nightmares came. The trial had been 2 weeks ago. The courthouse had cleared her. No charges, no suspicion, No further inquiry. But that wasn't what stayed with her. What stayed were the faces. How they'd all looked at her differently when she walked through town. Not with hatred anymore, but with pity, curiosity, even something like guilt. Yet none of it mattered in the cabin. Not when Eli begged for just 5 more minutes of story time. Not when Micah asked if she'd braid his hair the way his real mother used to, even though she never had the chance. Not when baby Samuel, who still barely talked, toddled to her in the morning and wrapped his arms around her legs like he'd always belonged there. She hadn't forced her way in. She hadn't replaced anyone. She had simply stayed. And loved. And listened. That morning, as she packed food into the wagon for their first spring trip into town since the snow melted, Micah looked up at her from the steps. "They'll ask again," he said. "Ask who you are." Lorene nodded slowly. "What do you want me to say?" Micah blinked, then stood straighter. "Say you're our mama, 'cause you are." Eli didn't say anything, just picked up a flower from the yard and tucked it into her braid. "Yeah," he said. "You are." On the ride into town, the boys bickered as usual. They asked for candy. They laughed too loud. And she didn't shush them. She let them be loud, let them be heard. And when they stopped outside the general store and someone asked, half sneering, "Are those really your boys?" Lorene didn't hesitate. "Yes, they are." The woman looked surprised, but then something softened in her face. "Well," she said, "they seem proud of it." And they were. Because when they walked back to the wagon, Micah jumped up on the wheel to climb inside, then turned and said it loud for the whole street to hear, "Come on, Mama!" Lorene froze. Her eyes burned. Not with shame, not anymore, but with the quiet weight of a name finally given without question. Not by a court, not by a man, but by the child she'd waited her whole life to belong to. And as they rode home, wind in their hair and spring blooming on the hills, Lorene leaned back and let herself believe something she'd never dared to before. Sometimes, love chooses you. Not all at once, not in grand gestures, but in one small word, whispered loud enough to change everything. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. When he called her Mama, did your heart clench too? Tell us in the comments.